And consequently, these skirmishes were not as effective as the Britons would have liked. Following these engagements, a major problem with the pre-Roman and actually often post-Roman Britannia emerged: disunity. The smaller tribes of Kent began to surrender, as did the Dabuni tribe, who held Gloucestershire, and also some other surrounding areas. There hadn't been a single major battle, and already tribes were surrendering. And to make matters worse, this almost certainly would have boosted the morale of the Roman soldiers and helped them shake off the jitters following the voyage. These Britons weren't the mythical, ferocious monsters of their legends. They were just people. People that feared them so much that they were surrendering without much of a fight. With renewed courage, the Romans continued their march inland, where they reached the Medway River. And that boost in morale might have taken a sudden blow at this point, because on the opposite side of the river, maybe about 550 yards away, was the British Army. A writhing mob of heavily armed men covered in woad and sporting wild, enormous hair. And rather than running in fear, they were probably hurling insults and battle cries across the river, inviting the Romans to come and fight. This was what was expected. These were the monsters they'd heard of. And if it wasn't for their famous discipline, I wonder if the legions would have stood their ground. I bet there was more than one soldier who considered running away, and then, considering the consequences of desertion, thought better of it. Now, the flip side of all of this is that despite having these half-naked, well-armed maniacs screaming at them, the Roman legions were likely silent in response. That was part of what made them so terrifying. In an age where battles were loud and filled with bravado, the Romans approached it with silent and methodical precision. Just imagine what it would have been like for the Britons. Their experience in fighting was generally fighting amongst themselves. So battles for them were small, loud, and personal. Well, here come these human tanks that just stare impassively at you as you do your best to scare them. And they don't even respond. You'd have to be pretty fierce to not have that shake your morale. So that's the setup. And so the Britons are gathered, ready for battle, and now they're under the command of Caractacus and Togodumnus of the Catuvellauni. And while we don't know the exact numbers of their army, we do know it was quite large. Further, we know they were arrogant, because they bivouacked in a rather haphazard manner on the other side of the river, believing that the Romans couldn't cross the river without first building a bridge. But we really shouldn't fault them for this. The Romans were heavily armored, and crossing without a bridge would have been slow, dangerous, and drawn a ton of attention. Therefore, thanks to their position, either the Britons would choose the time of engagement, or the Romans would have to build a bridge. So they were comfortable on their side of the river, believing that they had an effective rampart against the Roman advance. Unfortunately, they did not take into account the brilliance of General Plautius. After surveying the situation, Plautius ordered his men to line up in formation along the shore of the river. And the Britons were unimpressed, lounging about in their camp, because the Romans were really no threat until they started getting into the water. As the legions lined up, Plautius had his German auxiliaries sneak off on the flank, and once they were out of sight of the Britons, they swam across the river. See, the thing is that unlike the Romans, the Germans were accustomed to swimming in full armor. And so they did exactly that. And once they crossed the river, they crept as close to the camp as they could. And then they attacked the most vulnerable, and ironically, also the most effective, part of the British army: their horses and their chariots. The Britons were suddenly alerted to the sound of dying horses, and they charged the Germans. The ensuing chaos provided enough distraction for Vespasian to lead the 2nd Legion across the river and open up a second line of attack against the Britons. And yeah, that is the same Vespasian who would later become Emperor Vespasian. Things were getting dangerous for the Britons, and the fighting continued in a terrifying and personal manner for the rest of the day, and even late into the night. As the fighting dragged on, it was clear that everyone was becoming exhausted, and so eventually, long after the sun had gone down, hostilities were ceased, with the Romans bivouacking on their new camp across the river. But the fighting wasn't done. And once daybreak came, it resumed, and the Britons returned with an even larger force. The fighting was once again fierce and personal, and it began to look like the Britons would win, even without their chariots. But the Romans slowly and methodically pursued their own strategy. By pushing hard on the flanks and pulling back in the center, they were able to draw the Britons in and form a pincer movement, and were finally able to encircle them. Morale broke, and the Britons fled just before their escape was cut off. Using their superior knowledge of the lands, the fleeing British forces were able to move quickly up the Thames, through the forests and swamps. Meanwhile, the Roman advance was agonizingly slow, as they had to be forever wary of the threat of drowning, as well as the threat of ambushes. And oh yes, there were ambushes. And as was the case with early British warfare, it was in these ambushes that the Britons most often found success. Except, of course, for the ambush where Togodumnus of the Cativolani was killed. That ambush was not that successful. Now, you might expect this to be the end of the resistance. The Romans certainly did. But the death of Togodumnus instead had a unifying effect, and leadership immediately passed to his brother, Caractacus. The Britons, strengthened by a desire for revenge, attacked the Romans with renewed ferocity. But with every fight, with every stretch of land that was taken by the advancing Romans, it was clear how desperate their circumstances were. And so they fell back to Camulodunum. There are two schools of thought for what happened next. Some believe that Plautius was horrified by the new onslaught of the Britons and begged for the emperor to come aid him. I find that highly unlikely, as do many historians. The more popular viewpoint, and one that I subscribe to, was that it was clear that he was on the verge of a total victory, and he knew that that victory was to be Claudius's, as this was intended to be a sort of stage-managed campaign. Claudius wanted his mission-accomplished moment. And once Plautius realized that he accidentally conquered Britannia early, he needed to halt his advance and procure a final victory for the emperor. If he stole the emperor's title of Britannicus, his lifespan could become remarkably short. So in early July, Plautius sent for his emperor and dug in. From Caractacus's perspective, this must have been a bizarre development. I can't tell you how saddened I am that we don't have any accounts of the resistance from his or any Briton's perspective. The Romans must have appeared unstoppable, and then suddenly they just halted and didn't move for over a month. Was Caractacus religious? If he was, did he believe that his gods had gotten involved? There's so much we just don't know. Well, it wasn't until mid-August that Claudius arrived, along with his Praetorian Guard, and I kid you not, war elephants. In the interest of fairness, the elephants might have been brought over with the intent of scaring the British horses, since elephants typically would have that effect. However, I'm not sure how many cavalry units would be bottled up in the rebel stronghold, nor do I think that they would be particularly useful in any sort of siege. But nonetheless, Claudius brought them with him. So yeah, after kicking the bejesus out of the Britons, and doing it so thoroughly, in fact, that we aren't told of any further attacks upon the Romans by the Britons, Plautius and his legions held their ground and waited. And then the emperor shows up with war elephants. And at this point, as far as I'm concerned, if any of you believe what followed was a serious fight or something more than an ancient photo op, I have a bridge to sell you. So Plautius guided the emperor and his guard to the alleged rebel stronghold of Camulodunum, which is modern-day Colchester. And the village was defeated in short order. Now, some of you military buffs might be saying, well, how was it defeated? Give us more details. The problem here is that there just isn't much to give. Dio would have us believe